Comic books in the 90s just happened to have this gritty, grunge, extreme thing going on, and the last Avengers story was a pretty good example of this. With this really cool, chunky, gritty art style, it told a story set in the future with a new team of Avengers. Just kidding though, because they get completely wiped out within the first few pages. The current team of Avengers of this alternate future and their base are completely wiped out by an absolutely massive explosion caused by Ultron 59. Now Ultron basically then challenges Hank Pym and the OG Avengers to a final fight against himself, Kang, and the Grim Reaper. The thing is, there were not that many of the original Avengers left, with a lot of them being wiped out by villains or even by their own fellow Avengers. For example, Tigra was torn asunder by the Hulk, who had basically gone bananas, and then he and Wonder Man got into a massive fight that wiped them both off the face of the Earth. The Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver both lost their lives at the hands of the Vision, and the rest of the team just scattered. But while the 90s were characterized by the extreme, the early 2010s were characterized by zombies. It's just what happened. Probably because of The Walking Dead, to be perfectly honest. Marvel absolutely jumped on that with Marvel Universe versus the Avengers. Now this story, told from the perspective of Hawkeye, saw a plague turn people into intelligent zombies. The Avengers led any effort they could to try and contain the virus and save the populace. But when society collapses, it kinda seems to bring out the worst in people. The Avengers' efforts to save the world were consistently thwarted by infection, greed, and Dr. Doom, which I don't think anyone is too surprised about. It had a very grim ending, with most of the Avengers being wiped out entirely or going into hiding to survive any way they could, with Hawkeye's skull being smashed by an infected Thor. It's pretty rough. But moving on, during Jonathan Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers, one of the greatest Avengers runs ever, these things called incursions started to happen, orchestrated by the Beyonders. Essentially, two universes would crash together, destroying them both, and the focal point for that crash was the Earth itself. When the incursions started to threaten the multiverse, Namor the Submariner basically found multiple different ways to go about wiping out any alternate Earths that appeared in order to save Earth 616 and save both universes. That's pretty brutal on its own, especially when he teamed up with Thanos and his Black Order, plus some powerful additions. But then on top of that, the Avengers essentially got split right down the middle. On one side, Iron Man and his group were trying to save their Earth, while Captain America's faction essentially wanted to stop the amount of destruction caused by Iron Man and his side. Meanwhile, you've got extremely powerful cosmic heroes being wiped out by the Beyonders left, right, and center, and it all came to a climax as pretty much all of reality got destroyed and a massive battle between colliding Earths and opposing Avengers took place. Now, it's never a good time when friends turn on friends. While there was a clear winner in terms of who won the conflict in Marvel Comics' Civil War event, that being Tony Stark, in the grand scheme of things, there really wasn't any winner at all. The Civil War split the entire superhuman community down the middle. Heroes allied with villains, friends turned on friends, people were manipulated into joining a side, and a few of those people even passed away, all for an act that would require the registration and regulation of superhuman individuals following a completely avoidable superhuman caused catastrophe. And while you had Tony Stark coming out on top, he made a lot of enemies along the way, including Spider-Man, and I don't think he ever intended for the death of Steve Rogers. Also, after he came out on top, he was put in charge of S.H.I.E.L.D. and did a spectacularly bad job, leading to Norman Osborn, of all people, to take over, ushering in a whole lot of bad. I don't think anyone really came out from Civil War feeling particularly great. But the Avengers don't just exist in comic book form. Sure, the movies are never as vicious as the comics can be, but there is at least one occasion where things went pretty bad for our cinematic heroes. In the MCU, most of the movies follow a pretty simple idea of a hero facing and eventually defeating a villain, coming out triumphant by the end of the film, completing an arc. Even if the villain survives to continue into other films in the cinematic universe, they are still usually defeated by the hero at the end of their debut movie. Well, when we were given the Avengers Infinity War, it marked the first time in the MCU when the heroes, and furthermore, all the heroes together, officially lost by the end of the movie. Despite their best divided efforts to stop Thanos from acquiring all the Infinity Stones to complete his mission, he still managed to put them all into his big golden gauntlet and snap out half of the life in the universe. It left the heroes in shock of what even just happened as they watched their friends turn to dust, and when we meet them all in the next film, Avengers Endgame, they've all been left reeling and trying to just move on from such a massive defeat, which, sure, I guess led to one of their greatest victories, but whatever. Now, following the Civil War event, which we just talked about before, Tony Stark became the head of S.H.I.E.L.D., and he got one of the worst calamities to deal with in the form of Secret Invasion, where it was revealed that the shape-shifting aliens known as the Skrulls had basically infiltrated the Earth, with many of the world's heroes actually being Skrulls in disguise. At the end of that event, Norman Osborn was the one to actually save the day, and he made Tony Stark look so bad that Norman was actually given control of S.H.I.E.L.D. and the Avengers. But he made some big changes. Norman took the villains Daken, Venom, Moonstone, and Bullseye and repackaged them as Wolverine, Spider-Man, Ms. Marvel, and Hawkeye. Joining them up with heroes Ares, the Sentry, and Novar, Osborn himself donned Stark tech armor to become the Iron Patriot, and this team became known as the Dark Avengers to fans. Villains taking over as the world's premier superhero team went just about as well as you'd expect it to. Now, normally it's the Avengers who are going on the offensive in order to defeat the villains, but in Avengers Under Siege, it was the Avengers who took the beating. Determined to destroy the team who he believed had taken out his father, Baron Zemo II created a new version of the Masters of Evil, and under his leadership, this team of villains took down the Avengers with a quickness. They blitzed the heroes, taking their base of operations from them, and they put a few of the Avengers in the hospital, with Hercules, Captain America, and even their butler Jarvis being really badly injured. Not to mention the damage that they did to civilians along the way. The Masters of Evil took way too much pleasure in their job, and they were very effective. The Avengers were left without a home, beaten and demoralized. Now obviously things changed and the villains were eventually defeated, but we the fans hadn't seen the Avengers this badly beaten up until this point. The Avengers assemble. It's their thing. So naturally, when they're disassembled, it's not a good time. And it's mainly thanks to the Scarlet Witch. Wanda and the Wasp were just kind of chilling by the pool when Wasp decided to mention Wanda's kids. The only problem is that the existence of her children had actually been wiped from her mind, and when Wasp brought it up, it brought all those memories back, and Wanda absolutely lost it. Several things happened next, with none of the Avengers even knowing the cause. For starters, Scott Lang, Ant-Man, lost his life when a previously deceased Jack of Hearts showed up and just detonated. While the heroes were trying to figure out what even just happened, Vision showed up saying that he was not in control of himself and that he is sorry, as he also began to detonate, and then Jennifer Walters, She-Hulk, began to get uncharacteristically raged and tore Vision in half. Next, we saw Tony Stark at the UN conference randomly start to act as though he was incredibly drunk, even though he hadn't had a single drink, and he verbally accosted the Latvian ambassador and threatened him, and then a whole invasion by the Kree just randomly came out of nowhere, resulting in the passing of Hawkeye, and then the Kree just randomly left as quickly as they showed up. All of that was actually Wanda Maximoff using her reality warping magic. It almost led to the superhero community deciding to put Wanda into the afterlife, and it led directly to the House of M story. Now, while some brutal Avengers moments take place on a universal scale, some are much more personal, and the court-martial of Yellow Jacket is exactly that. Hank Pym is a founding member of the Avengers, but his legacy took a very drastic turn, and surprisingly, it wasn't because he was the one who created Ultron. Hank had a bit of a mental breakdown, and he ended up going by the name of Yellow Jacket, and that's fine. Call yourself whatever you want. But if you strike your wife, then no one is going to respect you, and that's exactly what happened. When Hank hit Janet Van Dyne, it basically became the defining moment for his character, and there was no way he could come back. But then he made it even worse. Pym essentially orchestrated a robot attack on the Avengers, and he figured that if he destroyed the robot, he could earn back the Avengers' respect. After Janet Van Dyne defeated the robot herself, Pym was kicked out of the team, and his marriage ended pretty soon after that. But finally, in at number 1 today, with a title like Marvel Ruins, you can imagine it's not all sunshine and rainbows, and it really wasn't. This is a story taking place in an alternate comic book universe where literally everything that could go possibly wrong does go wrong. It's honestly best to just list off some of the events, then get specific here. The Fantastic Four's spacecraft crashed into the Earth, and Ben Grimm was left with survivor's guilt, because he was the only one who survived. The Incredible Hulk is not so incredible in this universe, and the gamma radiation that he experienced left him as a hulking mass of tumors and deformity, and it's horrifying. Thanks to the radioactive spider, Spider-Man did not gain the abilities of a spider, but he instead developed an incredibly brutal mutant virus that left him with a terrible skin rash and had him captured and quarantined by the government. The Scarlet Witch in this universe betrayed the Avengers to the government, leading to the Quinjet being blown up with all of them inside. Nick Fury was introduced to the idea of eating other people by Captain America of all people, and Johnny Blaze just sets himself on fire as a stunt and does not survive. Even Magneto goes off the deep end here, with his powers going out of control in an airport, destroying literally everything. The whole story just leaves you wondering what you're supposed to do with your life now. It's very, very, very bad.
What makes these fights stand out isn't just the brutality, but the emotional connection you have to these characters involved, which honestly makes them not just physically brutal, but honestly emotionally brutal as well. Take for example the fighting between Conquest and Invincible. Conquest arrived at a time when Mark was going through some pretty intense stuff, so he was ready to let go and punch something as hard as he could. However, this is Conquest we're talking about, so even when Atom Eve flew in to act as backup, this fight ended up becoming quite messy. Like many fights in Invincible, this one spanned multiple issues, being wrapped up in issue number 65 after coming to a very gruesome end in issue number 64. Speaking of gruesome, let's turn to something that is also very gruesome. Is it more gruesome? I guess in some parts it kind of is actually. We're talking about Walking Dead. Honestly, reading this fight just made my jaw literally drop. Now granted, I'm not as well versed in the Walking Dead series, so anytime I come to this comic and read a few issues, I'm always pretty much shocked by what I read here. It's a lot of a lot. And this instance of course was no different. In fact, it is probably a beatdown that'll stay with me for some time. In this fight, Rick takes on a group of marauders, unlike in the Walking Dead show where this group is actually more specific, a group we've become familiar with who are known as the Claimers. In the comic, they're just kind of like a random group, I believe, of awful survivors. In the comics, Rick also only has one hand at this point, so keep that in mind, having lost it to the governor. But even with him having both hands in the show at this point, they made the ending to this fight the same, and both endings are brutal. With Rick in a bind, his arms restricted at his sides, he's asked, "What are you going to do now?" He responds by biting the man's neck zombie style. Yeah. Also, I just love how so many of the images from the show and the comic in this fight, like when I went back to watch the scene, are like one for one from the panels. It's pretty awesome. Up next, Marco and Alana are the two main characters from the Saga series. At least, they are at the start. The series begins with them both in the middle of delivering their first child while also being hunted down for having said child together. And while they do get away initially, they eventually are hunted down by the military before they're able to safely leave the planet. As such, they're forced to fight and defend their new little family unit. Alana is a deserter who takes no issue with fighting back, but Marco actually swore to be a pacifist since his daughter was born, but something in him snaps when he sees his family in danger. He reverts to a version of himself probably not yet seen since his own time in the war, brutally fighting the attackers. Fortunately, Alana is able to rein him in and calm him down, reminding him of his pacifist oath. This next one is honestly one of the most surprising brutal beatdowns I have ever read. This one also comes from Saga. I love Saga, in case you didn't know. I'm not up to date on it by any means, but everything that I've read so far in this series I've been obsessed with, and I really do want to get up to date. I just need to read a lot of things. There's a lot of issues. It's just such a great series overall though, so it really is worth the time. If you haven't checked it out, I do highly recommend just getting even that first volume and giving it a read. It'll hook you. Just the first few issues should be enough to just blow your mind. This brutal beatdown is also from near the beginning of the story as well. The Will is a bounty hunter. He has also been given the contract to hunt down Alana and Marco, but kinda early on he decides he might give up on the contract. Feeling he's already been beaten, he decides to use his unlimited credit card that he was given for the job to basically entertain himself. But while pursuing this entertainment, he runs into a really bad guy. Now most characters in Saga are very grayscale when it comes to their alignment, both capable of good and bad deeds. The Will honestly included. He's kind of terrible, but also he's got some pros. But I think we can all agree that this guy, the one he's up against, is like the actual worst. He's very bad. Needless to say, the Will surprised me by making very quick work of him. Discombobulate, bringing it to a new level. I don't even know if you can show it, that's how brutal it is. But basically, it's giving him one of these, the head squeeze. Moving on, the Whispering War is something we saw happen in both the comics of Walking Dead and the show. The show depicted the war a bit differently from the comics. There it was more like a literal war with armies on each side, and one side hunting down and eradicating the other in the end to win. Moving right along, Urizen is basically one of the worst of the worst of the worst when it comes to Spawn comics. He's a powerful villain and a mortal god who was basically imprisoned on Earth by the combined forces of heaven and hell. Yeah, that's how bad he is. Heaven and hell were willing to work together to take him down. However, Urizen was eventually freed from his prison and escaped. This was a world-ending scenario, not just because of Urizen's own power, but because his being unleashed was part of a plan crafted by Malbolgia to spark Armageddon on Earth. When Spawn first fought Urizen, it didn't go well, to say the least, which is why when he returned empowered by the ruler of Greenworld, Gaia herself, Earth, the beatdown felt pretty cathartic. If Spawn versus Urizen was cathartic, this next point was heart-wrenching. One of the most heartfelt fights you probably weren't expecting is the one that happens between Throg or Thrag, I'm still not sure how we're gonna say that, I'm waiting to hear it, in the animated series, and Omni-Man. These two fought during issue 138 of Invincible in a rematch. After Throg had been banished, he created his own hybrid child army by teaming up with the Thraxans. He had a lot of kids while he was away, and when he returned he sicked his offspring on Earth and took his own fight directly to Nolan. You might wonder how or why we'd ever feel bad for what happens to Omni-Man here if you're a fan of the animated series, but trust me when I say that Omni-Man is way more complex than you might otherwise think. Well, season 1, and I would say kind of still the first half of season 2, even paints him as like a pretty antagonistic and kind of like shady dude. There is definitely more to him than that. And at the end of the day, he's still Mark's dad. While the two have had their issues, Mark honestly does love him. Even when he's being a jerk, he loves him. Even when he's in denial, he does love him. And at this point in the comics, he was more redeemed than we've seen him before, which is why it was heartbreaking when we watched Nolan be brutally defeated by Throg, who not only put his fist through Nolan's chest, aiming for his heart, but then, when he missed, he just tore Nolan open. Terrible. Switching over to a different comic series with this next point, Spawn and Zera are opposites. While Spawn is one of the most powerful beings in hell, especially after Malbolgia is defeated, Zera is God's most prized warrior. She was an angel whom God granted immortality to so she can never die. At a time in Spawn when the war between heaven and hell was very dangerously present on Earth, these two meet up, and Spawn, basically being God tier at that time, makes quick work of Zera, slicing her in half. What's even more brutal is that Zera would survive this fight, but only as like a disembodied head due to her immortality. Cause yeah, she can't die, which in that way kind of becomes a curse when you're just a head. Spawn might be brutal, but there is another series that I think of first when it comes to beatdowns. I talked about it at the beginning of the list, you know where I'm going. I wish I could limit how much I talk about Invincible, but truly it's challenging. I just love it so much. The series is just so good, and it honestly is some of the most brutal beatdowns in comic book history. So yeah, we're going back there again. I'm gonna talk about it again. This fight is now one that many know about thanks to the Invincible animated series. As Omni-Man's true motivations are revealed to Mark, the two come to blows, and while Invincible is reluctant to fight against his father, Omni-Man is less inclined to hold back, honestly. This fight was so brutal, it quickly became one of the most iconic and most memeable ones ever. Seriously, it's between Invincible and Omni-Man for me, and Anakin and Obi-Wan in terms of like equally memeable and memorable brutal fights. Both of those are very memeable, I think. Next up, this has to be one of the most brutal fights within Image and within, honestly, all of comics. It spanned 5 issues and multiple days, with the series popping back to just remind you each issue, yeah, that's still going on. Those two are still fighting. I can't even give you one issue to read because that simply just doesn't exist. As it unfolds, it gets more and more brutal and gruesome. This is mainly because this fight goes down between Throg and Battle Beast. These two fight because Battle Beast has decided to team up with the coalition of planets and is sent to defeat Throg. But what he's truly after is not necessarily to complete his mission, but to die a warrior's death here. He sees Throg as his equal or possibly his superior when it comes to battle and hopes to die at his hands, or defeat one of the few who has actually managed to stand against him. To give you an example of just how intense this fight is, in the beginning, Throg is badly wounded when Ragnars are also unleashed from Battle Beast's ship at the start of their fight. Battle Beast was told that the Ragnars wouldn't be unleashed except as a last resort, and if you don't know this, Ragnars are basically some of the ultimate enemies against Viltrumites because they can actually break their skin. One of the few beings in the cosmos who can break a Viltrumite's skin, to be clear. After defeating the Ragnars, Battle Beast notices Throg's wound and injures himself to match to once again ensure this fight is fair. So not only does Battle Beast turn on the Ragnars, but then he also is like, oh, you're wounded? Me too. Now we fight again. And then they fight for days.
Captain Marvel and Thor once fought each other across the earth, leaving destruction in their wake. Captain Marvel entered her villain era against her will. She was captured by Vox Supreme, a villain, and they forced Carol to go and take out all the Avengers so Vox could harness their power. Thor was literally minding his business, hanging out, when Captain Marvel came out of nowhere to attack him. The two heroes ended up literally fighting across the earth. Thor is super confused because this was truly random from his point of view. He literally did nothing to Captain Marvel. Unfortunately, evil Carol does win and Thor's head is given to Vox. But we got pranked! Turns out it wasn't actually Thor, it was a clone of Thor. Captain Marvel couldn't just attack her friends, so she hid the real Avengers in a pocket dimension and then would just take out old clones. The Avengers were safe, Vox was happy, it worked. Vox was defeated when Captain Marvel trapped him in a coffin. Literally. Ultimate Captain America got his revenge on a Chitauri that was disguised as a Yahtzee with an N general that the Captain met during World War II. It sounds like a lot because it was. Obviously, Captain America hated the general, no matter if he were the actual human or the alien. So when the guy appeared in the modern day while the aliens were invading Earth, Cap got the chance to get some long-awaited revenge, and he took that chance. The fight was fiery, literally, and gruesome. The alien was putting in the work and nearly won, but then just had to mock the Captain and tell him to say, "I surrender." Captain America doesn't say those words, and the burst of anger gives Cap the upper hand. He managed to get the alien under him and used his shield to make the alien's chest into two pieces. Pretty much anytime Deadpool is involved in a fight, it gets ugly, and his brawl with the Hulk is no different. Deadpool Volume 3 Issue 4 features Wade Wilson receiving some pretty bad medical news. His healing factor isn't working as good as it used to, and it's getting worse every day. His healing factor is the only thing keeping Wade alive because he has a very serious form of cancer. The fix lies in radiation. Deadpool's cellular degeneration was slowed down due to the high amounts of gamma radiation in him. To make the process work as fast as possible, it would be best if Wade got gamma radiation that was already attached to an organic base. The Hulk has lots of gamma radiation and he has the organic base flowing through his veins, so Deadpool heads out to find the Hulk to get his cure. Deadpool does come in with a bang and the Hulk doesn't want to cooperate, so the two start fighting. What makes the fight so hard is that the Hulk doesn't really bleed. Deadpool tries almost everything and nothing works until he grabs a very broken, very sharp pipe. If it works, but I imagine it also probably hurt. Captain America Civil War the movie was a hard watch for MCU lovers. There were lots of politics and moral dilemmas in this movie that weren't always there in past movies, plus all our favorite heroes were fighting each other. For some people, that was great, getting to see how the heroes could hold up against their own teammates. For others who just wanted to see them as one big happy family, this was the worst. There were a few bonuses to the fight, I will admit. Spider-Man appeared for the first time, some Avengers joined the team that we hadn't seen in an Avengers movie before, but we also got that fight between Captain America and Iron Man that messed up the MCU. Bucky Barnes is Captain America's BFF. He was captured by Hydra, brainwashed, became the Winter Soldier, then while brainwashed, he took out Tony's parents. Tony finds that out pretty much in the middle of the Civil War. They had already been fighting about something else, so Tony doesn't take watching the tape of his parents' demise with the person who did it right next to him. He doesn't take that very well. But Steve Rogers can't let Tony just attack his best friend, so him and Tony battle it out. It's messy, the gloves are off, Tony has to watch Cap literally smash what was once his heart, Steve leaves his shield. It was awful. It made everything awful later on too. Wolverine once had to put an end to his own kid, and it was tough to watch. Wolverine had a son he didn't know existed named Daken. Daken hated Wolverine because he abandoned him as a child. His son is determined to get his dad back, and it was his demise. You can't go up against Wolverine. He has the ultimate healing factor and plot armor at his defense. Still, Daken tries, and he actually almost succeeds as he used one of the only confirmed ways one might end a Wolverine, drowning. Daken does just try and drown Wolverine. He does it while making Wolverine watch one of his students get attacked. But of course, Wolverine gets out of the tank, but now has to fight his own son. Wolverine wins, we saw that coming, but it doesn't mean the win was a good one. To take his son out of the picture, Wolverine used the method guaranteed to take out a Wolverine. He had to do it in a puddle. To make it even sadder, the writers decided to put in fake flashbacks of what life could have been like for the Wolverine family had things been different. Pulls at the heartstrings, honestly. Anytime an Avenger goes up against another Avenger, it hurts to watch. Thor and Iron Man's fight is no exception. This lead up to the face-off between the two Avengers involves the Superhuman Registration 50 States Initiative and Hurricane Katrina, two things I never expected to go together. After the hurricane, Thor travels to the affected city and he feels awful because he thinks he could have stopped it. Just overall, he is feeling a lot of feelings. Iron Man also shows up and decides that now is the time to tell Thor he will be persecuted if he doesn't work for the government based on that new initiative. Tony really does think he is a god sometimes. As much as I love him, Tony needs to realize that he is powerful but also mortal, and pushing the buttons of an actual god is not always the right move. Thor puts Tony in his place by hitting him with some lightning and then crushing his armor a bit. It's a reminder that even with all the fancy tech and money, Tony is still just a guy. The 2023 Hellfire Gala ended in disaster and a Nimrod ruining the party. Literally, Nimrod showed up and eliminated a bunch of X-Men, including the new X-Men lineup. So Nimrod is on a rampage. Iceman steps in to show off his Omega level mutant powers. He's giving everything he got and would have taken the fight, but his ice ended up being his demise. Nimrod melted him. How do you even recover from that? Obviously Iceman did, but even just your ego, how do you nurse a wound like that? Iceman did lose the ability to stay in a physical form long term and now lives in the Arctic. Spider-Man once had to face off against the Sinister Six in his own neighborhood after already being seriously wounded. In this case, we are looking at the Ultimate Spider-Man, specifically about the time the Ultimate Spider-Man actually passed on. Peter had already been in a few fights leading up to the big one. He even took a bullet for Captain America before his big final battle, so he's at like 50% health. The Sinister Six, Green Goblin, Doc Ock, Sandman, Kraven the Hunter, Elektra and Vulture have all escaped and are now out to put an end to Spider-Man once and for all. They end up in Spidey's neighborhood, except Doc Ock, he was taken out by Green Goblin. So instead of Peter coming home to peace and quiet and a bed to heal in, he comes home to 5 of his worst enemies ready to fight. Despite being wounded, Peter holds his own, taking out all the villains except Green Goblin. It honestly is a miracle that Peter lived as long as he did. When it's just Green Goblin and Peter, the Goblin just will not go down. It isn't until he gets personally acquainted with a truck Mary Jane was driving that Peter even gets a bit of an upper hand. Taking the opening, Peter lifts that truck and smashes it twice over the Goblin. That makes the truck explode and Peter gets thrown and perishes in the grass surrounded by his family, grateful he could at least save them. But you know what's wild? The Green Goblin still survived all that. He woke up long enough to smirk and then actually was done for. Infinity War and Endgame broke the internet and the hearts of MCU fans all over the world. As said before, Iron Man and Captain America are still not seeing eye to eye, so they are fighting with their own teams on opposite sides of the world, but fighting for the same goal: to get alien invaders off Earth and of course stop Thanos. The most brutal thing that happened in the first movie, I think we are all going to be on the same page when I say it was half the world's population turning to dust and the Avengers actually losing. Other horrible things to note though: Vision essentially getting his brain taken out by Thanos, Tony and Nebula getting stuck in space, and Gamora was thrown off a cliff. Then we got hit with Endgame and everything got better better and also worse. Tony is rescued from space and tells off Steve, and then they decide to be friends again because the world can only survive if they are. The team decides to use time travel to fix everything, and it works. The world is saved at the expense of Steve Rogers' younger years, Black Widow, and Iron Man. One thing about me is if you get me talking about Iron Man's death long enough, I will cry, so we are going to move on. That time when Magneto went up against the X-Men that resulted in him ripping the adamantium off Wolverine's skeleton was one of the most disgusting things I've ever seen. Wolverine's healing factor can make him come back from almost anything, but it was suggested that without outside intervention, it wouldn't have been able to help him with that big of a wound. Jean Grey had to hold Wolverine's body together telepathically so he would survive. This brutal fight went down in X-Men 25. It started because the US activated the Magneto Protocol. It puts a shield around the world that makes it impossible for Magneto to use his powers on Earth. Magneto didn't appreciate that, so he sent a pulse wave down to Earth that made pretty much all technology useless. You knew this fight was going to get ugly because Professor X gathered up all the X-Men to fight, and he was going in with intention. Him and Jean go into Magneto's mind to make him relive all his past trauma, and Magneto has a lot of that. They did it to weaken him from the inside, but it actually just made him more angry, and then he ripped the atom off Wolverine. Solid 0 out of 10 experience for everyone involved.
Kicking us off today is Marvel's Civil War event. This whole event kicked off because of a guy named Nitro. This villain has the power to explode, and when he did this, hopped up on a new substance, he wiped out the entire town of Stamford, Connecticut. This split the entire superhuman community down the middle, with Tony Stark leading half of them under the idea of superhuman registration, and Captain America leading the other half who opposed this. Wolverine partnered up with the former, and he was given a very specific task: to track down Nitro and bring him to justice. But when Wolverine actually managed to track the guy down, the villain did what he does best: explode. And when it happened here, he managed to completely incinerate Wolverine down to his shiny adamantium bones. But speaking of Wolverine's shiny bones, they did in fact lose their luster at one point, and that was more than brutal enough for this list. In the 1993 crossover event Fatal Attractions, Magneto was offering mutants sanctuary on his ship, the Avalon, and recovering from the legacy virus he was planning to completely wipe out humanity, being opposed only by the X-Men. Xavier, in a special Shi'ar suit, leads the fight against Magneto on Avalon, and Magneto holds everyone off until Wolverine gets the drop on him. Wolverine makes it really close, slicing Magneto across the chest just a little bit too close for comfort, and this pushes Magneto over the edge. He basically turns the adamantium on Wolverine's skeleton into liquid, and quite literally pulls it out of his body. It's gruesome. But there is actually more than one character to take on the Wolverine name. X-23's origin story was told in the 2004 miniseries X-23 Innocence Lost, which takes Laura Kinney from conception to independence, and man does she go through the ringer. Laura, unlike most of the other mutants, was created in a lab. This lab was called the Facility, and it's where attempts were being made to clone Wolverine/Weapon X from a recovered sample of his own DNA. The problem is that the sample was incomplete, resulting in constant failures. It was the work of a brilliant geneticist named Sarah Kinney that finally made the project a success when she combined her own DNA with that of the sample to create a genetic replica with near identical powers to the original Wolverine. This clone became labeled X-23, but Sarah secretly named her Laura. X-23 was trained from birth to be an assassin, treated fairly extremely and exposed to a trigger scent that would cause her to lose all control and give in to a brutal rage. The organization used this trigger scent to have her wipe out her sensei, as well as to make money off of her as an 11-year-old super assassin. Now eventually her mother, for lack of a better term, realized that she needed to free Laura. Plus, she also learned that the Facility was creating more clones, intending to train them in the same way, and she decided that she needed to take them all out. Thanks to Sarah, X-23 managed to destroy the Facility and the clones, but as she escaped, she discovers that the Facility have put the trigger scent on her own mother. Sarah ends up being taken out by Laura herself, passing away in her arms before X-23 finally gets to escape. But if we really want to dive into the brutality of Wolverine, we can look directly at Weapon X. A large chunk of Wolverine's life was spent being forced to work for the ultra-shady government group known as Weapons Plus/Weapon X. They are the ones that gave Wolverine those shiny adamantium bones that we talked about at the beginning of the list. Not only did they force Wolverine and many others into nasty nasty experiments to create super soldiers, they then hired out those super soldiers to the highest bidders, brainwashing these people into committing terrible atrocities. For example, Wolverine was forced to steal a boy named Frank Simpson and begin programming him to turn him into an enhanced killer. But then later on in life, Wolverine came across Frank in Vietnam as a soldier, and their interaction was anything but pleasant. Wolverine basically put Frank through the ringer, physically and psychologically breaking him to the point that Frank became a killer and started going by the name Nuke, which is when he became a Daredevil villain. Now, while Wolverine spent time on the X-Men team, he came into contact with one Dr. Hank McCoy, aka Beast. Hank is one of the 8 smartest people in the world, and being smart in comic books seems to be a pretty easy path to being morally dubious. Don't get me wrong though, Wolverine is not a Boy Scout by any stretch of the imagination, but he still holds on to his morals, for the most part. Wolverine and Beast were actually friends, and Beast stuck with Wolverine during the Schism event, and he was also on the side of the Avengers with Wolverine during the Avengers vs. X-Men event. But people change, and Beast is absolutely one of those people. In order to deal with external threats to the new mutant nation of Krakoa, Beast has taken a position as the chief of the intelligence agency X-Force, which has almost completely cost him his morality. McCoy has chosen some questionably authoritarian actions to guarantee the Krakoan sovereignty, like sabotaging the country of Terra Verde, squirreling away funds to open a space station prison, and interrupting one of Wolverine's resurrections to attach an obedience collar to send him on clandestine missions, all of which was kept secret from the rest of X-Force and the rest of the mutants. This ticked off Wolverine, which in turn ticked off Beast even more. He sent Wolverine on a mission so that he would be captured for an auction that Hank attended, and then he literally showed Wolverine to the afterlife in order to resurrect Logan again in a primitive state and turn him into Weapon X, where Beast sent him on more and more missions. Beast cloned Wolverine, and he used those clones as his own personal bodyguards and hitmen, and man, Beast has just become straight up a villain. No other way to put it. But Beast is nowhere near the most brutal villain that Wolverine has had to face. The Wolverine villain known as Cyber, for example, is one of the only villains to actually terrify Wolverine, with some adamantium-coated skin, toxic claws, and the power to track an individual's brain. And he's like 9 feet tall. In 1994's Wolverine number 79, Cyber is tracking down Wolverine in order to claim his adamantium bones, which he wants to then make a profit from. Unfortunately, at this time, Wolverine actually doesn't have his adamantium bones because Magneto took them away. So when the fight leads to him popping his bone claws, Cyber is a little more than disappointed. But instead of just walking away after this revelation, a cannon just goes off in the distance, and this gives Wolverine the opportunity to slash Cyber across the face. But as soon as the attack happens, Cyber catches Wolverine's fist, and in one stomp, he snaps Wolverine's claws in half, very much like Sabretooth did in Wolverine Origins, like the movie. That event scarred Wolverine, but right after, it made him even question his ability to be a hero in the first place. But moving on from that, the Thing is one of the most powerful heroes in the Marvel Universe, able to stand toe-to-toe with the Hulk in battle. He and Wolverine have had their scrapes, and most of the time, Logan's been on the losing side. In one little altercation taking place in Fantastic Four 1961, issue 374, Wolverine, Ghost Rider, Professor Hulk, and Spider-Man, who had previously taken the place of the Fantastic Four, were hunting for Johnny Storm, who had accidentally destroyed part of Empire State University. Now this led to an altercation between the 4 heroes and the Fantastic Four, but when Wolverine went to attack Susan Storm, Ben Grimm grabbed the Canadian and slammed him into the ground, calling him an arrogant little creep, because that's just what he does. But Wolverine, in his rage, used all of his might and he slashed Ben across the face, disfiguring the character in a huge way. Now the Thing got his payback as he yelled, "You frickin' little psycho," and then he whacks Wolverine with one punch, sending him flying through a bunch of buildings, but this actually scarred the Thing so bad that it had lasting effects throughout the comics. The post-apocalyptic world featured in the Old Man Logan storyline is one of the best things that Marvel has given us. but it's also one of the most brutal settings they've ever created. It all came to be when the villains decided that instead of fighting their usual villains, who they always lose to, they would instead put themselves up against whatever hero they were actually best suited to face. Now in the case of Wolverine, who is the main character here, that happened to be Mysterio. Mysterio is a master of creating illusions that trick even the senses, and he is almost always defeated by Spider-Man because of his spider sense. But for Logan, his super senses are one of his key traits, so when Mysterio uses his illusions to trick those senses into believing that the X-Mansion was being attacked by Doc Ock, Ulysses Klaue, Strife, and a whole squad of powerful villains, Wolverine believed it wholeheartedly and he held nothing back. Using his claws, he cut through the villains like butter. With all the other X-Men nowhere to be found, it was Wolverine versus everyone, and he was taking like 40 different villains to the grave. It was insane. When he finally took down the last one, who was Bullseye, the illusion actually lifted to reveal that these villains were in actuality all his fellow X-Men, who were just caught completely off guard by the sudden attack from one of their own. Now there are a few different characters who often appear in the Wolverine circle, the Wolverine family, you could call them if you wanted to, but if we are counting down a list of brutal moments for the character, then there is one person in particular who needs to be talked about, and his name is Sabretooth. Victor Creed seems to be bad simply because he enjoys it. As a kid, he took the life of his older brother Luther over a piece of pie, and was absolutely ruthless to his younger brother Saul, who he would make a habit of putting a beatdown on, particularly on Saul's birthday. When his mutant powers manifested, it only made bringing harm to others even easier for him, and he eventually took out his own father before going on a rampage through 3 Canadian provinces at just 13 years old. He would become a bit of a wanderer throughout his life, moving from different careers that allowed him to take advantage of his power in order to spill more blood. Now he eventually turned his savagery towards Wolverine, who happened to have taken the life of Saul, Sabretooth's younger brother. Sabretooth, in a really sick way, replaced Saul with Wolverine, making it his goal to make Wolverine's life a living hell. On every one of Wolverine's birthdays, he would beat Wolverine to within an inch of his life, and anyone Wolverine welcomed into his life, like those he would fall in love with, also became Victor's newest victims. And speaking of that, Sabretooth doesn't only try to ruin Wolverine's life on his birthdays. Anyone in Wolverine's life can become a target for Sabretooth, and Daken was Wolverine's son, born from Logan's marriage to a woman named Itsu, and the boy inherited his father's mutant abilities, but none of his morality. So in an attempt to gain revenge on his father, Daken teamed up with Sabretooth and the group known as the Red Right Hand, and the group's battle with X-Force culminated in Logan having to take the life of his own son. But with the powers of Wolverine, this is obviously no easy feat. Most people believe Wolverine is practically unkillable, but this is actually not entirely true. He does have 1 or 2 foolproof ways to bring him down, and one of them is water. With Daken leaving his pops no choice, Wolverine is kind of forced to hold his son face down in a puddle until he stops breathing. This moment is intercut with these like flash imaginations that Wolverine is having of the life that they could have possibly shared together if things were a bit more normal. Now just as Daken takes his final breath and Logan mournfully is holding his son, Sabretooth appears on the scene, revealing that this has been his intention since he first partnered with Daken. Needless to say, we kinda hate Sabretooth here. Starting us off today is Invincible. Invincible is a strange comic. It's an amazing comic, don't get me wrong, but it feels almost like a teen, coming-of-age, family-oriented comic mixed with the most insane, jaw-dropping brutality you've ever seen and a whole whack of mature themes. It's kind of crazy how wholesome the story can still feel, given all of that is happening at the same time. This story basically takes the idea of godlike beings akin to Superman and gives us a world where they don't really ever hold back, and then shows us the aftermath. But at the same time, Invincible has got a level of balance that makes all its incredible bone-popping, head-squishing brutality almost okay, because at the end of the day, it's still telling you a really good story about family, morality, corruption, inequality, standing up for what's right, finding oneself, freedom versus security, forgiveness, and building a better future, all wrapped up in a colorful package with a nice red bow, probably made from someone's intestines. Next up, the apocalypse in the Old Man Logan universe was basically what happens to the world if all the villains in Marvel Comics win. In the usual hero stories, villains face against their usual heroes and are always defeated. But in Old Man Logan, the villains organize themselves where simultaneously different villains and groups of villains will go against heroes that their abilities are best suited to deal with. For example, instead of fighting Spider-Man and his spider sense, Mysterio is sent against Wolverine, and using his illusions, he got Wolverine to wipe out all the other X-Men. It was incredibly messed up. The conflict ended up turning the United States into an apocalyptic wasteland ruled over by the Red Skull, with territories divided up and ruled by different villains. Almost all the heroes are gone, or they change sides, or they are working as mercenaries, or in the case of Logan, they are retired. That is, until the brutality of this wasteland brings him back into action. Now look, I know you hate it. You should know that I hate it. We all hate it, but it doesn't change the fact that Marvel Ruins is absolutely perfect for this list. This is a story taking place in a universe where almost everything goes wrong for almost every Marvel character. Some might say this is a universe that is incredibly realistic, or some might say that it's a story built on pure shock factor that seeks to do nothing except ruin your day. But it is called Ruins, so that kinda checks out, doesn't it? No one in this comic really deserves what happens to them, which makes it all so much more stomach churning. Take Peter Parker or Bruce Banner for example. When regular 616 Peter Parker gets bitten by a radioactive spider, he gains superpowers. When Marvel Ruins Peter gets bit by a spider, he develops an incredibly brutal mutant virus that leaves him with a terrible skin rash and has him captured and quarantined by the government. When the Hulk is exposed to the gamma radiation that would normally turn him into the Incredible Hulk, he instead transforms into a hulking mass of tumors, begging to be put out of his misery. It's awful, and that's only two examples of Marvel's massive roster of characters. Now look, I'm not going to say that Image Comics' Nemesis Reloaded is a good comic book. It's disliked by a lot of people because they feel it relies on shock and brutality while giving a main character that isn't really likable at all in any way and has a pretty lame plot. Are those critiques fair? I won't say they are completely wrong. I try to think of it as almost satire, but the gripe that I will 100% agree with is that it does rely pretty heavily on brutality, which makes it more than good enough to land on this list. Mark Miller created Nemesis with the whole idea being what would happen if you took Batman but made him a bad guy. Essentially, it asked what happens if Bruce Wayne used his wealth and resources to become a villain instead of a hero. The answer is the smartest man in the world as the world's only supervillain waging a war against police in all countries as revenge for a lost childhood, and he goes about it in the most insane ways possible while not really facing any major opposition. If all you know of Judge Dredd is the Sylvester Stallone movie from 1995, then you don't really know Judge Dredd. If you've seen the 2012 adaptation with Carl Urban, you have a better understanding of Judge Dredd. But even though Carl leaves people as gooey puddles on the floor and paints the walls red, he still doesn't quite hit the same level of debauchery as comic book Judge Joseph Dredd. Since appearing in 1977 in 2000 AD issue number 2, the character has had a long history that spans countless series, miniseries, and one-shots. Essentially, Dredd is a law enforcement officer known as a judge that serves as judge, jury, and executioner, facing off against robot rebellions, death-obsessed monsters from other dimensions, corrupt politicians, aliens, and the personification of death itself at one point. Oh, and I guess criminals as well. Surrender means nothing to him. He sleeps 10 minutes a day, he bullies his own friends, he has blown up entire cities, he's a fascist enforcer for a fascist government, and he pulls no punches, especially against people's heads. Marvel Max was a comic imprint that focused on adult stories featuring popular heroes and villains from the Marvel Universe. A few characters got Max books with varying levels of success, but it is easy to say that of all the characters best suited for this kind of thing, the Punisher is by far the best choice. So when Max published Punisher Max, it was not only one of the best Punisher stories out there, but as you can probably imagine, it was also one of the most jaw-droppingly brutal. Removing the Punisher from all the costumes and superpowers of the regular Marvel Universe and dropping him right into an America facing the early days of the War on Terror, Punisher Max shows the very real physical and emotional damage that Frank Castle's crusade would cause him in real life. But then, Marvel also released a new take on Frank Castle's dark origins with Born, a Max Limited series. This story takes place during Castle's time as a soldier in the Vietnam War, and as you'd expect, it featured graphic imagery and brutality that depicted
atrocities committed during the war that basically unlocked the darkness that led to Frank Castle being able to become the Punisher in the first place. Next up, created by superstar writer Frank Miller, Basin City, known to most of its residents as Sin City, is a place you would really never want to be a part of. Sin City is one of the most popular Frank Miller comics that eventually got turned into 2 movies of its own that are some of the most comic accurate adaptations ever. The comic does not shy away from deplorable human crimes that will make you shudder. The funny thing is that while other comics rely on graphic imagery, Sin City can make you shudder and cringe with just its words. Don't think that means that you won't see anything gross here. You will, you absolutely will. People in this book rarely live for very long, and when they go, it is almost never clean or quick, but I will say this, it is always stylish. The Walking Dead is a comic book series that's dear to my heart. It was the book that I first ever really collected, and it got me into Image Comics, but at the age that I was reading it, someone should have confiscated it and locked it in a safe. Sure, this comic book has to do with zombies, which are a horror thing and are historically rather gross and gory, but the zombies in The Walking Dead are just the vehicle to deliver a story about how absolutely depraved and sick us humans can be when our system of order and comfort goes completely belly up. Make no mistakes, the zombies are a threat, but the real villains of this story are the people, and in desperate times, people become monsters. This comic had me at multiple times sitting there slack-jawed and unsure of what to do with myself, wondering how this book can wipe my favorite characters off the face of the earth in the most brutal ways possible and still have me wanting to know what happens next, and it did it all without a single drop of color. Back in the day, a British superhero named Marvel Man was created, who was very similar to Shazam, as he could say a magic word and be transformed into basically a god. Now, due to legal disputes, this character basically got shelved for 20 years until 1982, when the character returned as Miracle Man under writer Alan Moore. As part of that revival, Marvel Man and his sidekick, Kid Marvel Man, were part of a secret government program and were attacked with a nuke. Now, they both survived, but Marvel Man now had no memory of his superhero alter ego, while Kid Marvel Man now believed that he was the only survivor of the attack, and he decided never to return to his true human child form ever again, eventually aging up into an enormously powerful adult. Unfortunately, his disillusionment at being alone in the world with his level of power turned him into a complete murderous psychopath. Issue 15 of Alan Moore's run is basically the entire climactic battle between Kid Miracle Man and Miracle Man, and his allies after the sidekick turned the streets of London into rubble, fire, and a gallery of human bodies, which is depicted in incredibly graphic detail. Moore and his artist Totalbin showed just how wrong and messed up the effects of a large-scale superhero battle on the world would actually turn out to be. Coming from Garth Ennis, who has created some of the most messed up comics like Preacher, The Boys, and the Punisher Max series, which we just talked about, is taking the top of our list today, and it's all thanks to a little comic called Crossed. Crossed doesn't have any heroes coming in and saving the day. This world has gone belly up, and there is almost no one who can stop it. The world of Crossed came to be when a mysterious disease starts running rampant, but this disease doesn't turn people into zombies. This disease turns people into completely and utterly depraved psychopaths with cross-shaped rashes on their faces. These infected people will do everything and literally anything to anyone or anything that crosses their path, whether it's friend or foe, human or animal, fully grown or new to life, and every bit of it is shown in full graphic detail, and I am not joking when I say everything. But then, somehow, through all of that, the characters that pull it all together are fleshed out with meaningful backstories that they carry into this hellish world. Is it worth a read? I'd say so, but it is #1 for a reason, so you have been warned.
What could possibly be a greater defeat than the loss of Batman's parents? Well, how about the loss of his confidant, butler, and most importantly, lifelong father figure, Alfred? I don't think he gets much more brutal than this. While the death of Batman's parents, of course, is tragic, Alfred was there to help pick up the pieces and, in essence, help to raise the boy before his parents passed, and of course, thereafter. Alfred is probably one of the closest people to Batman, and was more of a parent to Bruce in the end than his own parents were able to to be, due to them of course being taken away from him so many years ago. Alfred was shockingly killed by Bane after Bane kidnapped him. Bane made threats that if the heroes attempted to interfere, Alfred would pay the price. When Damian Wayne didn't take Bane's threats seriously and he set out to save Alfred, Bane made good on his promise and killed him. This was all part of a larger plan to break Batman again, but this time mentally and psychologically. What's the worst kind of defeat you can imagine for a hero to suffer? Is it something that's psychological? Is it something that's more physical? What do you think? I recently got caught up with the second season of Invincible. Episode 5 is out and Invincible is back, baby, in case you missed that announcement. And if you did, well, get ready to jump back in. It's so good. This episode really blew me away with just how brutal it was. This show and comic series both do an excellent job of creating both physical and emotional stakes for their characters. While I could talk about any of the memorable fights in the comic series, there are many, I want to give a special shout out to the fight between Alan and the Viltrumites. Now this happened earlier in the season in this show and goes down as well in Invincible issue number 23 pretty similarly, though not quite as drawn out I feel like as the animated version of it is. However, just like in the animated show, Alan does have his eyeball pop out and is left very much beat to a pulp on the verge of gruesome death. Oh boy, we're going to the Ultimate Universe for this next one, so you know it's gonna be brutal because Ultimates. It comes from the Ultimate X-Men series. Here, Sinister, who looks super different in this universe, FYI, in case you were wondering what's going on with that, infiltrates the X-Mansion and manages to sneak up on Charles Xavier himself. Despite his immense telepathic powers, Xavier here is no match for Sinister, who takes him out of the security room he was in, where he was seemingly surveying his students. Kinda creepy to be honest. When Charles asks Sinister where he's taking him, Sinister responds that he's escorting Xavier to his one true enemy, and then he pushes him down the stairs. Extremely rude and completely awful, yes. Xavier isn't the only one who gets brutally and honestly insultingly messed up by Sinister though in this fight. Angel also in this fight goes from being intimidating in one panel to psionically manipulated into choking himself in the next. Batman has lost a lot of Robins over the years and a lot of adopted sons. Damian Wayne was his natural heir, well, natural-ish. As natural as it gets till we get Helena Wayne in the main continuity, that is, if that ever even happens. Damian was the son of Bruce Wayne and Talia al Ghul. He was raised by Talia and the League of Assassins without Batman even knowing of his existence until years later when Talia basically just dropped him off on Bruce's doorstep declaring that Damian was his son. Initially, the two of course did not get along very well. Damian was stubborn in his ways and he insisted on killing as he'd been trained his whole life to do. But eventually he came around and he actually began to see the value in his father's approach to fighting crime, respecting it and even admiring it. Just as their relationship began to evolve into something more resembling a true father-son connection, Damian was tragically killed by the Heretic. A death that Batman can't even bring himself to avenge at the time when he realizes that the Heretic is Damian's clone. Following Damian's death, we also got Batman issue number 18 from this volume, an issue that focuses on the mourning of Damian's passing by being completely wordless. At the end of the Absolute Carnage event, Cletus Cassidy as Carnage gave Eddie Brock a choice between saving the world or saving his son. It wasn't a simple choice, but it was one that he simply had to make. Eddie ultimately had to choose, more specifically, between saving his son and letting the world fall victim to Null pretty much, or not saving his son and the world would probably still fall victim to Null anyway. But he wouldn't be the one who was more linked to this impending doom, at least in that scenario. Still though, clearly neither of these options are very good. In the end, Eddie of course chose to save Dylan, which ultimately led to the awakening and return of Null via Eddie Brock, who absorbed all the codices. This was a brutal defeat to read because Carnage just laid it all out and basically clarified that either way, Eddie was going to lose and Carnage would ultimately win, even if he didn't survive this fight. And even still somehow, Carnage did seemingly survive. Mera and Aquaman are often presented as being romantic partners and sometimes as a crime-fighting Atlantean duo as well. However, this doesn't mean that they never fight between themselves. And during the Blackest Night event, they actually had some good reason to. At that time, Aquaman had been possessed by the Black Lanterns, joining their forces, and Mera was driven into a rage by the death of the last standing family member, Tempest, causing her to become a Red Lantern. During one page in Green Lantern issue number 50 from the 2005 volume of this series, Mara takes on the deceased Arthur Curry, and when he attempts to win her over through what I can only describe as kinda weird, messed up empathy, I imagine trying to distract her from her rage by attempting to bond with her over the loss of their son. This, however, fails to work, and Mara frightens him off masterfully, responding, "I never wanted children," before seemingly killing them both with her blood, which as a Red Lantern was transformed at that time into liquid napalm, as all Red Lantern's blood is liquid napalm, in case you didn't know that. While this clearly wasn't Arthur's most heroic moment in the comics, Aquaman is still usually considered a hero, which is why I'm still gonna count this one here. Also, it's a really brutal fight. I love talking about it. It doesn't get much more awful than this defeat here. This one happened as a greater part of the famous Daredevil story Born Again. In issue 227 of Daredevil, we are told the story appropriately titled Apocalypse. And indeed, if you are Matt Murdock in this story, I'm sure that you would certainly feel like an apocalypse of sorts was upon you. Here, Kingpin finds out Daredevil's secret identity, and he uses it not to simply kill him, but instead to destroy his entire life. First, Kingpin comes for his law practice, making it seem as though Matt bribed a witness in his case. But it doesn't stop there. He comes for his finances, his sanity, and even blows up his apartment, and in the process destroys his costume. However, while DD is left feeling pretty defeated by this whole thing, he at least now has a name to pin this all on, seeing it all as the work of none other than Kingpin. This is going to hurt you a lot more than it does me. Famous words that come from the Joker before he brutally attacks Jason Todd with a crowbar. This all went down in the Batman story A Death in the Family. Fans at the time were able to vote on whether or not Jason Todd would live or would die. After the brutal attack on his life in issue 427 that ends with an explosion going off which buries his body in rubble, in issue number 428 we'd get our answer to this fateful question, and ultimately it would be established that Jason had in fact died. Although much later on we learned this actually wasn't quite true when he seemingly returned from the dead years later as the antagonist and anti-hero Red Hood, all because Superboy Prime basically punched reality. Ugh, this one made me cry just all over again. Every time I come back to it, it makes me cry. Okay, so here we're talking about the death of Spider-Man, which honestly happened more than once in the Ultimate comic book line and universe, but I do think this is actually the better death. This is Spider-Man's death done right, in my mind. If you have to do it, obviously, because I don't think many of us would really ask for something this heartbreaking, but here we are. Also, sometimes we need something heartbreaking because it makes us feel feels, and that's pretty cool. During Ultimate Spider-Man issue 159 through to 160, we see Peter in his final fight. Unmasked and with nothing really left to lose, he is forced to give it his all to protect the people of New York City, and more specifically his friends, his family, his loved ones, and the people of his own neighborhood. In the end, despite everything he does in this epic final fight, which spans multiple issues, he is defeated by the Green Goblin. And the ultimate version of the Green Goblin is an unstoppable force, and as we later find out, is also immortal, an immortal tank of a villain. This fight and defeat has it all though, ups, downs, it's an emotional, action-packed roller coaster. And while Spider-Man does seemingly die, so seemingly does Norman Osborn as well, in the end. So while a defeat, there's also some poetic justice felt in the end too. But goodness, Aunt May, boy do I feel for Aunt May here. Also in the end, I mean, both of these people would be fine as well, so they'd both survive. But in the moment, it was heart-wrenching, just trust. One of the most memorable and memeable lines from this superhero defeat and the Invincible animated series overall is, "Think, Mark." However, there is a more brutal line than that said by Omni-Man during this fight. One spoken when he suggests that he could kill Mark with his own hands and just make another child. Oh, he asks, "What's 17 more years?" My heart! As a Viltrumite, Omni-Man's lifespan is of course much longer than a human's, so 17 years is of course a brief span of time to him. This reduces the emotional connection he has built up with his son over the years to something that he deems as basically being seemingly meaningless, which is honestly just heartbreaking to watch, especially when you know how much Mark still loves his dad even through this whole messed up encounter, making the beating that Mark takes here just even more brutal. Nevertheless, we know that for Omni-Man, who does love his son, it's not that simple. Ultimately, while he does win the fight, he is unable to deliver the killing blow, which says it all, baby. These two faced off in Wolverine Volume 3, Issue 31 during the Enemy of the State story arc. We're talking about Gorgon and Wolverine. Now, Gorgon is known for being a fearsome villain who can, as his codename implies, turn his enemies to stone with just one simple little glance. In fact, Gorgon has actually successfully killed Wolverine before. That's just how even of a match this was going into it. He then had Wolverine resurrected and brainwashed him so that he might use him as his own assassin, turning him against his friends and colleagues in the hero community. I hate when that happens. In the end though, Wolverine got him back. During their fight in issue number 31, Wolverine seems to take a page out of Perseus's book. He defeats Gorgon using his own claws to reflect his own gaze back onto himself. Genius. Turning Gorgon into stone before then shattering him into a million pieces. You're not coming back from that easy.
The villain known as Mr. Mxyzptlk is technically a bad guy, but he's more just a reality warping nuisance for the Man of Steel, and he absolutely did not deserve what happened to him in Superman Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow. In the story, a wide array of Superman's villains all make their play on the Man of Steel, and after he naturally defeats everyone, he is still left wondering who organized all these ne'er-do-wells. Turns out it was Mr. Mxyzptlk. Mr. Mix reveals himself and goes on a villain monologue about how basically he has lived for a long time and he's kind of bored of being mischievous, so now he wants to be evil, and his first evil act will be taking out Superman himself. The fifth dimensional imp then reveals his monstrous true form and goes on the attack. Now luckily for Supes, he grabbed the Phantom Zone projector and he used it on the villain, but at the same time, trying to escape, Mr. Mix spoke his name backwards. With both things happening at the same time, Mxyzptlk was completely torn in half between both the Phantom Zone and the fifth dimension.
This one was a disturbing, heart-wrenching, and shocking moment from season 1 of Peacemaker, a series that surprised me in so many ways, and in so many of them delightful ones. One such startling moment happens when Peacemaker is forced to face off against his dad, White Dragon. While we know pretty early on that Peacemaker's dad, Augie Smith, is pretty much the worst role model or parent anyone could ask for, we also see that Chris Smith, aka Peacemaker, still cares deeply for his father, despite all the awful things his dad has done to him. Rather than rightfully blame his father for his messed up upbringing, Chris seems to just blame himself almost just as much, if not actually more, making the moment when he actually faces his father a tense one. Years of pent-up rage, disappointment, shame, and frustration manifest in a single instant when White Dragon goads his son into killing him, commenting on the fact that he doesn't believe his son is in essence strong enough to even do so, and in the process causing Peacemaker to snap, resulting in him doing just that, killing his own supervillain father.
Rudolph Jones found himself exposed to a strange form of radiation which changed him into the bald, green-skinned parasite with the ability to absorb the life and energy of others. In Firestorm, the Nuclear Man, issue number 86, Parasite is released from an area he is being held in and goes on a rampage, draining multiple people of their life energy, including Firehawk, who fell pretty easily to this villain. Now luckily the hero Firestorm is nearby. At this point in time, Firestorm has become the world's fire elemental and received a pretty significant power boost. Firestorm comes in hot literally on Parasite with a blast of flame, and then when Parasite tries to drain Firestorm's power, the hero is completely unaffected. He delivers this cold line about how he himself is just straight up power incarnate, and in a desperate effort, Parasite tries to trade energy blasts with Firestorm. Unfortunately for Parasite, it is nowhere near an equal fight. He uses up all the energy he took, and then just trying to hold back Firestorm's blasts, Parasite goes through his own reserved energy as well, to the point that he is on the brink. He even starts to beg Firestorm to stop, but he had every intention of taking Parasite's life until his friends show up and pull him back. It's actually a really dark scene.
In issue 116 of Spectacular Spider-Man, Peter crosses paths with, get this, Sabretooth, when he shows up to attack Black Cat, who had just escaped the Foreigner's clutches. Sabretooth was sent to make her pay, and while Felicia doesn't seem to be too afraid of Sabretooth's threats to skin her alive, Spider-Man returns just as Victor is set to pounce. The two tussle and Peter leaves Victor crying out when he shoots him in the face with webbing. Victor rips it off his face, in the process doing damage with his own claws. Even though Peter tried to warn warn him to not do that, proving that not only is Spider-Man stronger than Sabretooth this time around, but he also seems to be quite a bit smarter here too.
In Spawn number 27, we learn of Philip Kron, who has spent his entire life studying the occult so that one day he could gain access to heaven. Now, I'm not really sure that's how that works, but either way. Calling himself the Curse, Philip decided the best thing to do in his heavenly endeavor would be to bring down the Hellspawn Al Simmons. Now, Spawn was an agent of heaven at that point and was imbued with mystical energy, which Philip would then siphon off for himself. But because he is clearly no match for Spawn, Philip goes with a complete sneak attack on Simmons, blowing a hole clear through Spawn's chest. Unsurprisingly, Spawn wasn't especially pleased about being ambushed, so he tracks down the Curse and blasts off his bionic arm. The two then engaged in a battle, but since Spawn was at full power and the Curse was just a crazy guy in a costume, he didn't really last very long at all. Spawn beat the absolute beans out of the Curse and then strung up his almost lifeless body against a wall in an alleyway to ward off any further enemies. That would have resulted in Philip's passing, but his fate was somehow even worse later on. You'll have to read for that one.
This one is truly brutal and devastating for me because, in a way, Starro was quite a misguided villain. In James Gunn's The Suicide Squad, Starro is cast in the role of antagonist, but Starro is not malicious here per se, or at least not malicious without cause, let's just say that. Starro was an alien who was captured and used for various experiments as part of Project Starfish. The Suicide Squad has been sent in to shut down said project after the United States learned of how dangerous the project could be if unleashed on the entire world. When the team finally uncovered the truth behind Project Starfish, it's too late and they accidentally unleash the captive, mind-controlling cosmic being, Starro, on the world. Amanda Waller is surprisingly fine with this, as it will destabilize Corto Maltese, which actually benefits the US. However, the squad decide to rebel against Waller and take on Starro anyways, because they're like, we should save these people, a lot of these people are innocents. Thanks to a combination of commitment and luck, they manage to defeat Starro, but as Starro and all their offspring lay dying, Starro broadcast their last thoughts, reminiscing on what their life was like prior to being taken captive on Earth. I was happy, floating, staring at the stars.
Okay, so spoilers for The Boys comic book series, which finished in 2012, so you've had over 10 years to get caught up. What was arguably the biggest twist of the comic came near the end of the story, in issue number 65 specifically. Luckily, this twist does not seem to be present in the show given what's already happened, but basically, it turns out that Black Noir is secretly a Homelander clone. He was created with the whole purpose of being meant to take Homelander down if he ever lost control. The problem is, Homelander enjoyed being a puppet for Vought International, and that put Homelander in their good graces, so he never ended up going rogue. This made Black Noir incredibly frustrated, as that was his life's only true purpose and he had been denied it for years and years and years. So, in the final issues of The Boys, after slowly watching Homelander grow more and more insane, he finally snapped and attacked the White House, taking out the president. This finally gave Black Noir the go-ahead to finally do what he was finally made to do finally. He shows up to go to the White House in the 65th issue, reveals himself as a clone, and then goes for an absolute slogfest against the completely shocked Homelander. They quite literally rip each other to shreds, with Black Noir coming out technically on top before he stepped out onto the front lawn, missing significant chunks of his body. This is when the US military, alongside Billy Butcher, brought this insane soup to his brutal end with some final blows from Billy Butcher's crowbar and his fist.
Geist vs. Magneto has to be one of my favorite all-time short-lived and brutal villain versus villain fights. Though really, between them, it's pretty apparent that Geist is the real villain here, I think. Magneto ends up doing his best to catch Geist and ends up running into him after he escapes punishment in Terra Verde, in the late 80s Wolverine series. Magneto lures Geist out with a little mechanical toy and makes short work of him. While his fate isn't explicitly shown here, considering that Geist is a cyborg and Magneto is the master of magnetism, we can imagine how brutal this fight would be, yeah? And based on what we do see of what happens to the decoy toy, robot toy I was talking about. It's probably not pretty, whatever goes on off page.
And we aren't done with Spawn. This time we're going to issue number 322. Essentially, there was this vampire named Paul, and he had taken a girl and he had been keeping her in his house for years and years. He's truly pretty despicable, and Spawn doesn't let that kind of thing slide. Spawn's anger and rage made him so powerful that none of Paul's attempts to stop the Hellspawn even fazed him, and Al quickly incapacitated the vampire using a horrifying amount of bugs. When Paul comes back to, he is chained up and it has been 5 days since the vampire last fed. On top of that, Spawn had controlled some roaches to go inside of Paul and eat away at anything that was keeping him alive. So this guy is starving. Spawn then lets a mouse go down a very skinny hallway and informs Paul that along with the mouse there is even more food for him at the end of the hallway, and he can either go down it or stay where he is and be consumed by roaches. As you can imagine, Paul chooses the hallway, but Spawn had also removed all the spikes from his costume and put them on either side of said hallway, so Paul has to be torn to pieces if he wants to go to get to the other side, all while the bugs are coming after him. But when he finally forces his way through, Spawn is waiting there with Paul's mistreated dogs who have also not eaten in 5 days. Spawn gives Paul the key to the exit, which is back at the other end of the hallway covered in spikes and hungry insects, and needless to say, Paul doesn't make it through. Capable of making any command and having the people around him go through with it regardless of the nature of the request, there's almost no one who can resist the powers of Purple Man. It makes him a truly terrifying villain, but there is at least one person who has resisted the influence of Purple Man, and his name is Victor. Victor Von Doom. I'll admit this may not be brutal in the traditional sense. In Avengers Emperor Doom by David Michelin and Bob Hall, Dr. Doom abducts the Purple Man and puts him in a psychoprism that amplifies his powers and uses him to gain mind control over the Avengers, with the plan being to then take over the rest of the world. From his prison, Purple Man curses at Dr. Doom and basically says that Doom doesn't deserve the power he is stealing from Purple Man. But don't you dare hurl such insults at Dr. Doom. Doom orders everyone else in the room to leave, he takes off his mask, removes the shield that kept the Purple Man from controlling him, and he confronts Purple Man head on. Given this massive opening, Purple Man orders Doom to be his servant. He demands he stands on his head, take a flying leap, and even hard delete himself. But by sheer force of will, Doom resists the Purple Man's commands, horrifying Purple Man into obedience, and it is awesome.
One of the most epic fights ever went down between Perpetua and the Batman Who Laughs. At the time, both of these characters were absolute powerhouses. I mean, Perpetua just naturally is, and Batman Who Laughs had the power of Dr. Manhattan at this time. In fact, he was no longer known as Batman Who Laughs, but instead had taken up the mantle of the One Who Laughs. Now that he had Dr. Manhattan's power set. I guess once you have that much of a power upgrade, time to change your whole name up and just become the One. Not the Dr. Manhattan though, by the way, but instead an alternate reality version of Batman who happened to also be a version of Dr. Manhattan, because that's the whole thing basically. Despite the fact that Perpetua is one of the most powerful beings in all of the cosmos, the One Who Laughs managed to trick her into getting the crisis energy that would have powered her, putting him more on her level. Then they fought until all her power was his.
The two strongest foes Superman has ever faced are almost definitely Darkseid and Doomsday, and when they ended up fighting each other, it was absolutely nuts. In Superman/Doomsday Hunter/Prey #1, Doomsday attacks Apocalypse after returning back to life. Now once Desaad warns his master that Doomsday is demolishing the world, Darkseid decides to take matters into his own hands, and unceremoniously receives a seriously humiliating beating. Darkseid blasts Doomsday with an Omega Beam, and it does basically nothing. Doomsday then delivers a series of massive blows that makes quick work of the Tyrant. The fact that Doomsday is basically a mindless killing machine, Darkseid's manipulative fear tactics don't do diddly squat against Doomsday whatsoever. It's so bad that in the following issues, when Superman makes his way to Apocalypse with other DC heroes and attempts to defeat Doomsday once and for all, Darkseid, licking his wounds, actually agrees to help the Man of Steel stop Doomsday, with the collected group leaving Doomsday all the way at the end of time to finally defeat him.
Harley is by far one of my favorite characters over at DC Comics, which is why I thought I knew how this fight involving her would go. And not just because she is my favorite character, but also because she is extremely popular across the board. Plot armor is a real thing, my friends. Not only that, but Harley is more experienced and has accomplished impressive feats in the past, like taking out the entire Holy Trinity of the Justice League in one single fight, that I think may have even been on like one single page or something like that. It was pretty short. But that didn't guarantee her a victory this time around. The fight between Harley Quinn and Punchline, Joker's new partner in crime, was inevitable due to their shared connection to the Joker. Although, to be clear, Harley was Joker's girlfriend during her time as his partner in crime, and Punchline seemed to be more just strictly business. Some people still say that she's Joker's girlfriend, but as far as I know, I don't think she actually is. Surprisingly, despite being new, Punchline was also extremely popular and surprised readers when she seemingly handily defeated Harley Quinn in a brutal fashion, leaving her to basically die in the sewers. Don't worry though, this is Harley Quinn we're talking about, so she did survive this fight, and even for a time, a very limited time, sported a badass scar that she'd gotten from the encounter across her neck. That is, until everyone else forgot about it and it just magically vanished, because this is comics.
The question of who is stronger between the Mad Titan Thanos and the time-traveling Kang the Conqueror has been one asked for a while. They don't normally fight each other very often, and they both somewhat rely on extra items. Like, if Thanos has the Infinity Gauntlet, obviously he's got a major advantage, and when Kang doesn't have his suit, he's basically useless. But these two did actually fight each other, although I'll admit for this point they did fight each other in an out-of-continuity comic. Taking place in Avengers Mech Strike #4 by Jed MacKay and artist Carlos Magno, Kang has hooked himself up to the body of a Celestial, which gives him basically godlike levels of power. In response to that, the Avengers decide to bring in a young version of Thanos in order to face Kang. Now this Thanos comes from a time before the character becomes aware that the Avengers will be one of his main adversaries in the future. The two battle it out for about a minute, but then Kang simply grabs Thanos by the neck and forces time through his body, aging him up literally an eternity in a matter of seconds and leaving only a Thanos-sized skeleton behind.
One of my favorite, most brutal moments in all of comic book history, we are talking about the fight of Dr. Doom versus Thanos. What a fight. Now granted, these two were fighting not necessarily on the most even of playing fields, if I'm being honest. Doom at the time was considered God Emperor Doom when he ended up as the ruler of the entire multiverse for a while. This happened during Secret Wars, something we might soon be seeing coming to the MCU in some form, and probably a version of this exact Secret Wars from 2015 as opposed to the original Secret Wars or Secret Wars 2, which are both from the 80s. During Secret Wars, Doom accepted the responsibility and power needed to reshape the multiverse during the final incursions, and ended up ruling over a patchwork sort of world he had built out of the collision, with each Earth sort of inhabiting its own realm or province in this new world. One of the people who dared to try and stand up against him was Thanos. But he made quick work of the Mad Titan, thanks to Doom having absolute power here, so yeah. Didn't stand a chance. Granted, this was all part of a larger plot to topple his regime, so although Thanos lost because he was part of that plot, kind of won.
The Earth 3 Superman is a very evil version of the character. Going by the name Ultraman, he is Superman, but power obsessed, fueled by kryptonite, and an incredibly ruthless dude. In the Adventures of Superman John Kent series, Ultraman obtained a device which allowed him to drain the power of his alternate universe counterparts, and he embarked on a mission throughout the multiverse, taking out and draining every Superman that he could find. John was recruited by Earth 2 Superman to stop Ultraman, and he confronted him on Earth 49, where Ultraman overpowered John until the son of Superman unleashed a new exotic energy power which helped John knock down Ultraman before he collapsed of exhaustion. But just as Ultraman was talking about traveling to John's home universe and wiping out Lois Lane, the Superman of Earth 49 showed up, and what do you know, it was another evil Superman. The Superman of the Injustice comics and games. And that guy snapped Ultraman's neck like it was nothing, ending Ultraman once and for all right there and then. It's nuts, but it was so awesome.
Who are two of the craziest villains that you could ever imagine fighting from Marvel Comics and DC Comics? And what if I told you they did. Back in the good old days when Amalgam Comics was around, Carnage and the Joker actually ran into each other and even briefly teamed up with one another before Carnage ultimately decided the Joker was too crazy even for him. Carnage was more interested in murder and mayhem, whereas Joker was more interested in creating elaborate plots to torment his victims more slowly and kinda just making a bunch of jokes. This caused the two to turn on each other. Carnage tried to fillet Joker while Joker sneakily got away and blew up the warehouse they'd been hiding out in. Of course, this wasn't enough to destroy Carnage, but that was when Batman and Spider-Man showed up on the scene, prompting the villains to turn their fighting against the heroes instead of one another.
Following Marvel's secret invasion, Norman Osborn was handing control over the Avengers. Hiring a bunch of villains and giving them the iconic looks of some of the mainline Avengers, this new team of Dark Avengers became the world's premier superhero team. Now, after receiving a distress call from Dr. Doom, a member of Norman's inner circle of dastardly devils called the Cabal, Osborn led the Dark Avengers on their first mission, to save Doom and Latveria from a horde of demons led by Morgan Le Fay. While the Avengers appeared to immediately win the battle thanks to the Sentry, Morgan, being a time traveler, simply returned from the past and took out Sentry and turned Ares into stone. As more and more of the Dark Avengers fell, Osborn asked Doom to use the time machine located in his armor, bringing the two of them to 690 AD to defeat Morgan in her own era. Unfortunately, Morgan points out that Doom can't simply wipe her out since it will jeopardize the timeline and cause a paradox. So what does Doom do? He casts a spell that gets Morgan sucked up by a cauldron and sent all the way back to England, but in 1 million BC, where she has to deal with being hunted by dinosaurs and trying to survive. Dr. Doom is my favorite. I love him. He's so cool.
I feel like anytime Magneto and Red Skull clash, it's bound to be brutal due to their history. They have had a few fairly brutal encounters, and what's even more wild is that Magneto doesn't even use his magnetic powers, usually, to dispatch Red Skull. More often than not, including this time, he manages to come up with a seemingly worse punishment than that. I mean, at least if Magneto used his powers on you, it could be over quickly, although could being the important word there. But this time around, during Axis, Magneto preferred for Red Skull's demise to be, as he put it, as pure as possible, choosing to only use his fists.